Today I'm going to continue reading the book Transactionalism, an Historical and Interpretive Study by Trevor J. Phillips, starting with Chapter 4, Transactionalism in Contemporary Psychology. Previous chapters of this study have examined the main contributory antecedents of and have investigated in detail the current philosophical movement known as Transactionalism. The intent in the present chapter is to describe the situation that arises when transactional viewpoints and modes of inquiry are applied in the field of psychology. The resulting discipline, transactional psychology, is expected to have implications for educational practice. The final chapter will investigate these implications and their collateral significances. The nature of man, some historical views. The union of transactionalism and particular aspects of that area of inquiry known as psychology yields a unique view of human nature. A review of some selected historical concepts of this phenomenon is necessary to provide a foundation for a fruitful examination of the transactionalists' assumptions to follow. For the remainder of this study, the word psychology is understood to symbolize that expanding body of knowledge which seeks to explain human behavior. It is therefore seen to be concerned with man's description and exposition of himself, of his human nature. Pre-Platonic views. The attitude or belief known as animism would appear to have been mankind's first attempt to ascribe meaning to his own behavior and that of other objects of nature. Certain natural objects were believed to possess their own unique spirits, which were held to be detachable from the object's material substance and able to take up residence in other bodies, thus influencing or dominating the body inhabited. In this way, control of behavior involved the seeking by man the aid of friendly spirits in order to gain his own ends, while at the same time contriving to prevent hostile spirits from entering and assuming control. How objects would behave, was viewed by primitive man as highly unpredictable. Their animation was the result of their responding to the inward promptings of the indwelling spirits, and further, every object was supposed to act from essentially the same causes and motives as man himself. In attributing every detail of the external world to the operation of personal life and will, man regarded his world not as a universe, that is, a system of interrelated facts, but a collection of independent things. These independent things, he assumed, operated spontaneously and not in accordance with universal and immutable laws. In other words, primitive man did not have a conception of dead matter to set over against the conception of a free and purposive mind. Anaxagoras, a Greek who lived in the 4th century BC, was the first philosopher to have suggested an actual difference between matter and spirit in man. But it was Democritus, approximately a century later, who made the first influential synthesis of matter and spirit, of body and soul. He proclaimed that the entire universe was composed of microscopic individual particles or atoms. It was the difference in form which the atoms assumed that accounted for difference in quality between the soul and the body of man. Plato. Platonic psychology was an elaboration of the earlier view of the dualistic nature of man, but it ruled out the possibility advanced by Plato's predecessors that the human soul had a physical nature, asserting that soul and body were discrete entities. Such a psychology must be characterized as spiritualistic and dualistic, and one in which bodily processes and sensory perceptions are minimized and underestimated in any context that also included a discussion of the soul. Plato's differentiation between the sensory and the intellectual, which arises out of his theory of knowledge, illustrates a further distinction, that of the spiritual and material worlds. According to Plato, the world of ideas is the only real world. The world of matter is merely its shadow or inferior copy. The respective statuses of these two worlds was made incontrovertibly clear by Socrates in the discussion by him concerning the acquisition of knowledge. I reckon that we make the nearest approach to knowledge when we have the least possible intercourse or communion with the body, and are not surfeited with the bodily nature, but keep ourselves pure until the hour when God himself is pleased to release us. And thus, having got rid of the foolishness of the body, we shall be pure and hold converse with the pure. It is the object of this knowledge to fathom the transcendental world of ideas, a world in which the soul once was resident, prior to its association with the earthly body, and the world in which absolute good resides. Any knowledge of this good, which the soul acquired while inhabiting the world of ideas, is lost to consciousness when union with the body occurs. What remains is a reminiscence of the earlier reality, a memory trace, which is continually stimulated by the bodily senses. It is noteworthy that in this doctrine, the process of learning is seen to be the attempt to recall that which man had known in a former life but since forgotten. According to Plato, man was to be defined as the soul controlling body, the soul controlling the body. When the soul and body are united, then nature orders the soul to rule and govern, and the body to obey and serve. Now, which of these two functions is akin to the divine, and which to the mortal? Does not the divine appear to be that which naturally orders and rules, and the mortal to be that which is subject and servant? Already stated, Plato's psychology, his attempt to explain human nature, was primarily spiritualistic and dualistic. Sense perceptions, together with all bodily processes, were overshadowed by considerations of knowledge and the soul, both of whose ends the former were called upon to serve. Because of his preoccupation with ultimates and ideals, Plato's writings contain little psychological observation based upon studies of human behavior. It is to Aristotle, who was concerned more with sensate things than his teacher, that the first genuine attempt to describe and interpret human experience and behavior in concrete terms must be attributed. It is to an examination of this attempt that the study now turns. Aristotle. If, to 20th century scholars, this great figure of antiquity is something of an enigma, it is because he has been interpreted in many different and oftentimes conflicting ways. Contemporary writers representing particular viewpoints and ideologies have allegedly located in the works of Aristotle statements and concepts which they believe support and justify these doctrines. For example, Randall has recently published a book on Aristotle which has elicited the following criticism from a fellow commentator: a lively and readable study of a functionalist Aristotle, but an Aristotle so instrumentalist, so Deweyan, as to have little connection with the founder of the Lyceum. Nevertheless, most approaches to Aristotelian thought concede that in contrast to the dualistic nature of Plato's psychology, a dualism composed of body and soul coexisting in each individual, Aristotle had not conceived the notion of the self as a pure spiritual being to which its body is as much part of the outside world as other physical things. For him, soul and body formed a union, which, while it lasted, is complete, and in which the two are viewed as merely aspects distinguishable by the philosophic eye. In the ensuing discussion, it is seen fit to translate Aristotle's soul by the term psyche, in order to escape the Platonic and later meanings with which soul was and came to be invested. It was Aristotle's belief that all living things, including man, possess a psyche, which is their form, a psyche which is in some sense the principle of animal life. Psyche, then, could be considered as life. It was the complex but determinate power which all living things exhibit, and is not to be understood in terms of the body or the body structure. Rather, it is to be grasped in terms of various general differential functions. In the opening paragraphs of On the Soul, Aristotle inquired whether the psyche has parts or not. It later becomes clear that he had in mind functions, not parts, which are able to be distinguished for purpose of distinction, and which are to be described in terms of the specific operations they make possible and lead to under the appropriate stimulus of some factor in the environment. In the order of investigation, Aristotle wrote, the question of what an agent does precedes the question what enables it to do what it does. That is, powers are to be understood in terms of their operations. According to Randall, we understand the power of sight or vision in terms of the activity of seeing, and likewise the instrument by means of which vision operates, the eye. Aristotle is a thoroughgoing functionalist and operationalist. Although Aristotle was emphatic in his rejection of the mind or soul-body dualism, in his discussions of the thinking process, of the intellect, the nous, or of the active reason, there is little doubt that he slipped into dualistic explanations. For example, he viewed thinking as a result of the intellect being acted upon by the thought object, as a function, an activity or behavior of the human organism closely related to the psyche. If thinking is like perceiving, it must be either a process in which the psyche is acted upon by what is capable of being thought, or a process different from but analogous to that. The thinking part of the psyche must therefore be, while impassible, capable of receiving the form of the object. That is, must be potentially identical in character with its object, without being the object. A brief reference to Aristotle's theory of recalling is pertinent because it was, historically, to form the basis for the doctrine of association in later learning theory. Aristotle maintained that recalling occurs because a series of associations are able to be called up according to specified principles. Whenever we are recollecting, we are experiencing certain of the antecedent movements until finally we experience the one after which customarily comes that which we seek. This explains why we hunt up the series, having started in thought either from a present intuition or some other, and from something either similar or contrary to what we seek, or else from that which is contiguous with it. Thus, similarity, contrast, and contiguity were considered by Aristotle to be the three sorts of relationships in the chain of memory associations. A contemporary student of Aristotelian psychology has summarized the Greek philosopher's conception of man in a fashion which, although obviously influenced by Randall's functionalist interpretation of Aristotle, is admirable and concise. He is a generated perishable thing. His coming to be and his entire existence are the product of various factors which may be subsumed under the terms body and psyche. It is his psyche which constitutes his essential nature, and its analysis shows it to be the activity of the individual, considered as an organic whole. On every level of living, and increasingly so as higher capacities come into view, this activity is understood in terms of determinate potentialities of the organism, actualized by the stimulation of the environment. The psyche is thus a joint function of both the organism and its environment. And with that, we'll end the first part of Chapter 4. Thank you for listening.